Welcome to Autism Knows No Borders, a podcast where people connected to autism inspire change and build community. Together with the Global Autism Project, I'm your host, Rachel Harmon, a professional with over a decade of experience in the field of autism services, outreach, and advocacy. What does autism support look like across the globe? In part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Stephen Shore, he delves into how to move from autism awareness to autism acceptance. We discuss autism awareness around the world, challenges in autism acceptance, practicing cultural humility, the need for strength-based approaches and recognizing diverse abilities within the autistic community, meaningful inclusion strategies, and disclosure and self-advocacy. In this episode, discover what's possible when A is for action. And now I present you Dr. Stephen Shore. All right, so back to the 4 A's. You also mentioned that you've done a lot of international presentations, educating communities on the ground. What are your impressions of how autism is viewed around the world, specifically in relation to the 4 stages you just described?
Countries are in various stages of those 4 A's, and also organizations within countries. So I spent a lot of time in Russia and find that, just like I find everywhere, there can be these pockets of best practice or near best practice and understanding of autism, even though there might not be much in the way of resources in the country as a whole. So what I found when I started going to Russia is that there was a lot of focus on awareness. People were becoming aware of autism. They were in that first A phase and now transitioning, seeing more transitions in organizations to the acceptance phase and working with autism and appreciating those characteristics. An organization that comes to mind is Our Sunny World in Moscow, led by Igor Spitzberg. And in this organization that has, it's not really a school, but people do come into the building. They have over 350 clients. They subscribe to matching approaches to individual needs. So they'll evaluate a person and then decide whether they go to the ABA suite because maybe that's what will be more helpful to this person, or that person might get referred to the floor time suite and they'll get floor time intervention, or they might get a combination of the two. So that's an example of better understanding of autism. There's a great organization towards the south in Ukraine, in Kyiv to be specific, called Child with Future. They focus on using the teach approach, which is a perfectly fine thing to do, to focus on a particular approach. Nobody can be an expert on all of them. But also, there's great understanding there that different approaches work for different people. So if what they can do doesn't help, they may refer that person to somebody else, or maybe they'll work on providing what that other approach is that could be helpful. Likewise, there's another organization in Peru known as CASP, it's the Ann Sullivan Center for People with Disabilities, is what it is. And they've got an amazing program. It's not ABA, it's not TEACH, it's not Miller Method or floor time or one of the other approaches we know, but they've cobbled together something that works really well in providing support and including people with disabilities in general, so autism and other conditions, in the community. So they've got a great employment program and other supports for people with disabilities. I'm seeing a lot of work being done in China in recognizing autism and finding ways to work with autism. I haven't heard too much these days about China, but I think we'll hear more when the pandemic is over.
Yeah. We have a couple Global Autism Project partners in China, actually, in Nanchang and Nanjing.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've been to Nanjing.
Yeah, there's a center there called U Plus Academy where they actually integrate a lot of technology. It's really cool. I've never been personally, but
I've heard about it from the founder of that center that they've developed a 3D mapping room where there are screens on the floor and on the walls and on the ceiling, and you can kind of walk into whatever scene that you want. So let's say you're teaching safety with crossing the street. Well, you choose that setting, and all of a sudden the room turns into a crosswalk.
Oh, that's interesting.
So you can practice safely without real cars.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing some really cool stuff there also with teaching social skills and, for example, spotting different circles of color on the floor and having the children move along in kind of like circle time, so that they're able to take turns and follow a routine that way also.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So I look forward to when it becomes safe to travel again and seeing what's being done in China and various other countries.
So when you go around the world, are you invited to these places, these organizations? How do you connect with them? Are they looking for a speaker?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it works. It's mostly word of mouth. I don't do any hard advertising or promotions. Some people do. I guess some people don't. But it's more by word of mouth. People hear me speak at a conference, and then they want me to come to their organization and talk at their conference or do some kind of consulting, giving workshops, whatever it might be. Yeah, that's pretty much how it works.
So when you arrive at the organization, let's say, are you then able to do an assessment of where they lie along the 4As and then adjust your presentation accordingly?
Yeah, I do, because it's important to provide people what they need. So I have about 18 different presentations. And usually what people want will fit into one of those topics. However, sometimes topics will be mixed and matched. And very often there'll be something new that I need to add to a presentation because it fits what that organization needs. So the presentations continually evolve from one to the next.
Mm-hmm. In your experience, have you found a particular country that is really moving along quickly along this pipeline and reaching that level of appreciation where they're actually creating job opportunities specifically for autistic people?
Well, I think it's probably easier to talk about organizations within countries, unless the country is really small.
Okay.
So, for example, in Qatar or Qatar or however you pronounce it, I know when I go there, they pronounce their country. It's not as Qatar and not as Qatar either, but it's something somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
They're doing a lot of work. And in fact, I'm going to start some intensive work with them on employment, setting up an employment program with them with the Qatar Foundation, with a colleague of mine, Robert Nassif, to be specific. And what they want us to do is set up a program for individuals on the spectrum so that they can find and maintain meaningful employment. Part of that also includes developing awareness and training for potential employers as well.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's an example of a whole country. It's a small country, so it's a little bit easier to manage. But as you get to some of the larger countries, such as you can include the United States as well, it's more regional in nature. There are places in the United States that have excellent supports, and services, and everything you could ever want. But there are also some places in the United States that are just as lacking in supports and in need of education, starting with awareness, that you might see in some of the more challenging areas of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it goes the other way too. Some areas of the world where there isn't much at all, but you find these pockets of best practice.
Mm-hmm. What are some common challenges that you see across countries when trying to move from that level of awareness to acceptance?
I think it's making people more aware of what autism is and what it isn't. So what that means is dispelling myths of autism.
Mm-hmm.
Dispelling those myths and assumptions that people make about autism, and helping people to understand you can learn a lot more about autism by getting to know autistic people.
What are some of those myths that you come across?
Well, some myths include all autistic people are computer geeks, is one. Another one is autistic people don't have or perceive other people's emotions, whereas, in fact, in many cases, I find that it's the other way around, and that we may be too much in tune with another person's emotions and feelings, but don't quite know what to do with them and might get overloaded in some way, which then could cause a shutdown and make it seem like that we're not aware of another person's emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two.
Got it. So in your work, you're presenting as an autistic person, so they're able to see firsthand and talk to an adult with autism. I know we have a partner in Saudi Arabia. They work primarily with young children. And I was asking them if they know any adults with autism that are self-advocates, kind of speaking to their communities and showing what autism looks like, not only in childhood. And they couldn't name anyone.
Yeah, so we need to do a lot more work in Saudi Arabia as well. I've been to Saudi Arabia twice, and I saw a lot of good effort being made when I was there. So it would be interesting to return to that country to see what has happened between then and now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our director of outreach at the Global Autism Project, Cassie Harden-Scott, she talks a lot about the steps to community outreach and how we really need to empower parents to empower their children to become that self-advocate that's representing their communities.
Right.
So it really starts from within. I mean, it's great what you're doing as an outsider coming in, but they also need to see what autism looks like within their own communities.
Oh, it sure does. And that brings up another challenge which is important to address when working internationally. And that is autism strategies and concepts and whatnot is not something that you can export. What that means is that it's very important to make sure that you're culturally relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Maintain cultural relevancy. So with the work that we're doing in Qatar, we putting a lot of effort into making sure that whatever we do is culturally relevant. And an example might be is that when I talk about employment, one important strategy, at least in the United States and similar countries, is to get the child involved in doing chores at home, making the bed, feeding the cat, keeping the house clean. And that can work well in many, many cultures. But there may be other cultures where it's just a part of that culture that somebody else does that. And there's a caretaker of some sort. And if that's the case, then the opportunities for doing household chores just don't exist. And so you can't recommend things that don't exist in a particular culture. And you have to become aware and sensitive to these cultures, to these differences. And you can't say they're good or they're bad, they're just differences, and you have to find ways to work around them. So that way, that will prevent problems with recommending things or suggesting things that just aren't going to work in a particular culture.
Yes, exactly. That is basically the motto of the Global Autism Project as well, do with, not for. When we go into these other countries and we're providing training to their local staff, we're working with the teachers, and it's a constant assessment of what is important to them, what is socially valid for them.
Right.
Because if we come in and we just put in our own Western ideas of what it means to live a quality life, then it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to stick when we leave for them to continue on in whatever teaching they're doing with their kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It's important to get to know another culture to be accepting of other cultures, different ways that people do things. And that's just part of what we need to do with autism as well. So as we look at these autistic characteristics, we need to turn away from thinking that perhaps they're bad and just removing value judgments and just saying, well, that's just the way it is. Sensory issues just are. Differences in communication just are. They just exist. And now the question is, what can we do to work with these differences?
Yeah.
With the person who doesn't speak and probably will never speak. So can we find another means of communication and work with that? And likewise, in various cultures, there are just some things that will never be done in the United States that are done in other countries that might be helpful in the United States, but that's just not done here. That's not the culture. And then we can flip it around too. There's things that we do here that aren't done in other places. So we need to work with what there is.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, Rachel here. I'd like to thank one of our listeners, Izzy0826, for reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. They said, "Thank you for having conversations that will help people grow and think beyond stigmas and misinformation. Thank you for the kind words. 5-star reviews like yours help us to continue spreading autism awareness and acceptance around the world. If, like Izzy, you're finding value in Autism Knows No Borders, please leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts." And now, back to the conversation.
Can you maybe tell a story of a time that you were out in a different country and you had to really practice some cultural humility, like maybe something that was surprising to you in that moment and that you had to actually stop yourself and think twice?
Yeah, well, maybe, I think it was China that I was at. And I was talking about the need for supporting adults and for individuals who are at autism level 1, formerly diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, because the focus seemed to be on early intervention of people with more significant challenges. People would be diagnosed at autism level 2 and 3. So I was talking about that people in other portions of the spectrum need supports that they need, and also adults. And the response that came back is, we know adults exist. We know that people with Asperger syndrome exist. However, at this time, we only have the supports. We can only get support for people who are more significantly affected. So it was that point that I suddenly realized, all right, let's work with what is and then expand things as resources and time allows. And what I found in different countries, is that it is those individuals who are more significantly affected who are noticed first and they're provided support first. In every country except one, and that's Singapore, where it's worked in the opposite direction. And that's probably because a parent of a child with Asperger syndrome had good connections in government and a lot of support. So there were these amazing supports for people at autism level 1. And you can go to the Pathlight School of over 1,000 students with Asperger syndrome there, and it's a state-of-the-art facility. What about individuals who are more significantly affected? Well, there wasn't much there, and support for those with more significant challenges was provided by the Department of Recreation and Parks. So not even an educational.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there wasn't much there at all. However, over the past 10 or 15 years, there's been much greater recognition of people with more significant challenges, and they are now receiving supports that they need to get. So they've evened themselves out. So just as most countries seem to progress from people who are more significantly affected and much more noticeable to those with Asperger syndrome or autism level 1 or adults, Singapore went in the other direction.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
And good for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
That also reminds me of some of our partners in Africa. We have actually our longest standing partner in Kenya, and they just opened another branch of their school in Tanzania. And they've talked to us about the stigma of autism and disabilities in general in that area of the world. And it's scary because some of these kids are really in danger, especially the ones who have significant needs that you can kind of spot out in the community in public, maybe because they're stimming at a grocery store. And there is a genuine fear that they're going to be kidnapped and killed because it's thought that they might be possessed by evil spirits. And, at that point, it's like these families are keeping them at home for their own safety. It's like you need to start there also and address that so that they are better equipped as parents to handle whatever behaviors might come up, whatever meltdown might come up in public, and maybe even train them on what to tell other locals around them, to use that as a teaching opportunity and educate people about autism.
Yeah, exactly. And in that way, we can increase public awareness. And again, that's where it starts, of what autism is and what it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of myths that need to be addressed. A colleague of mine told me, who's from India, told me of a situation where this person was walking around on his farm and unexpectedly came across a nest of vipers, poisonous snakes, and he killed them. Maybe they were attacking him, who knows, but whatever, he killed them. And then sometime later on, that couple had a baby who had a cord, his umbilical cord, wrapped around his neck and resulted in cerebral palsy. And the belief is that those snakes had come back and exacted revenge on their child.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot of superstition that goes on.
Right.
And it's hard in these areas of the world where maybe you're trying to battle religious beliefs and show science instead. How have you handled those situations when maybe you're talking to an organization or a family that is still very much on that side of awareness?
Yeah, well, it can be a big challenge. And sometimes it's just a matter of working with what is. So if you have someone believing that the spirit of the snakes came and attacked your son and caused this situation, it's not really something that you could change, but you can still provide support with where the child is now and what are some strategies to help that child lead a fulfilling and productive life.
Yeah, I see that. So not necessarily contradicting their beliefs, but again, working with that.
Yeah, exactly. So as we've talked about a few times already, it's really a matter of working with.
Mm-hmm. All right, Stephen, we have a question from one of our listeners on Instagram, self-advocate MV. And she wants to know, what are best practices to support autistics in the world today? I know you've already kind of answered this in regards to focusing on what's best for that individual, but maybe this could be a good opportunity to weave in what your ideas of meaningful inclusion strategies are.
All right, so meaningful inclusion is when both the autistic person and the others who they're interacting with, be it in a classroom, be it at work, be it in the community, everybody benefits from the situation. And that's when you have true inclusion. Sometimes I see what I call geographical inclusion. And that is where the autistic person, a person with a disability, is in the same room, is in a regular education classroom, but they're off in the corner doing something with their paraprofessional or support person that has nothing to do with the rest of the class. And they say that's inclusion. Well, I suppose it is. It's geographical inclusion. So doing what you can to make sure that that person is meaningfully involved in whatever the activities are. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing the same thing as everybody else, but they're still meaningfully involved. So I've seen situations where you have an autistic person who wants to be involved in a school football team, for example. But due to various reasons, they're never going to be a football player. It's just not going to work. Maybe for physiological reasons, maybe for cognitive reasons, whatever it is. But that very same person is still intimately involved with the team as, for example, the hydration manager, and make sure that everybody has sufficient liquids to remain hydrated, or something else. And that's an example of engaging in a related activity, but still being meaningfully involved in the situation. So that's an example of inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I used to work for an AB agency in Oakland, California, and I was assigned to some schools in Berkeley. And at that time, this was, I think, 2017, they had just shifted the whole district to full inclusion, and it wasn't working. It was exactly what you're describing, where the student was in the room, in the corner, with the one-on-one therapist working with them, but just completely excluded, really, from what the rest of the class was doing. And it was also not fair to the teachers who weren't really trained on how to include the student meaningfully.
Right.
It was just kind of this overnight change, and, you kind of deal with it. And she's there he is there trying to manage 30 plus students and not having the tools to really help that student succeed. So it was really frustrating for me as the BCBA on the case, coming in and trying to help them, but they just didn't have the resources or the time outside of the classroom to really learn these extra strategies.
Yeah, and then that's another big challenge, is proper support for educators to understand and support their autistic students.
Yeah. So it really is a kind of, if you look at it from a holistic point of view, there are so many different moving pieces. And how can we best provide the right environment, not just for the student, but for the other students in that classroom as well?
Yeah, exactly. And that gets into the whole area of accommodations and curriculum modifications. And what I've found is that modifications that are made, be it in a school situation or be it in a workplace, while they initially may seem expensive, take a lot of time to put together, these modifications end up benefiting other students as well. And really are just extensions of good teaching practice, or just in general good inclusionary practice.
Could you give a quick example of what one of those modifications could be?
Yeah, I sure can. So, for example, some modifications that are familiar to most people are access ramps to buildings. Expensive to especially retrofit, and maybe they look kind of ugly too, but we need to support people who have mobility impairments. And now what I see is that people with two perfectly good working legs walking up an access ramp and not taking the stairs because it's easier. And certainly anybody who has a heavy object to wheel into a building will appreciate coming into the front of the building instead of having to go to the loading dock in the back. Closed captioning that we see on TV programs, on YouTube, and various other videos.
Mm-hmm.
Initially just for people with hearing impairments, but anyone who's been in a noisy airport, a noisy bar, or some other noisy situation that will make hearing a television impossible appreciates being able to read what is happening at the bottom or the top of the screen. So that's just an example. A couple of very general examples. In education, it might be that, and I've gotten these requests, a student requires an advanced organizer every day for every class meeting, which is really just an agenda.
Uh-huh.
Wouldn't everybody benefit from having that agenda?
Yeah.
Either on the board or as a handout. sometimes I'll get a request from the student of office support. Such and such student needs a copy of the teacher's notes.
Mm-hmm.
My initial response is, well, I don't have teacher notes. I don't write out everything that I'm going to say, mainly because it just takes too much time. But what I do have is a copy of the PowerPoint presentations on the course management software that all students can access and download. And so I'd send that back to the student support office, and the response will be, oh, that's really what the student needs, so you're all set. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah, that's a great tool that can help for the rest of the class too.
Right, and as we think about environmental modifications, be it for lighting or ventilation or just being in a quiet space to learn, everybody benefits from that. And it makes me think of some hotels that, I don't know how much they do it now, but they used to make a big deal about having these special hypoallergenic rooms. We'd be in a quiet part of the hotel. There'd be hardwood floors instead of a rug, so that it'd be kept clean. They'd have all natural bedding with high thread counts, and the room would be cleaned with organic or natural products. And then my question is, wouldn't everybody want that room?
Yeah.
So just do it for all of the rooms instead of just a few.
Right.
So it's things like that where improvements that we make for autistic people tend to benefit everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And in the workplace, I think about supervisors. A number of supervisors have remarked to me, all this work that I've had to do to better communicate with my autistic employees has made me a better manager or supervisor overall as I communicate with the rest of my staff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, being more direct, for example, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Stephen, I want to switch topics and talk about disclosure. You mentioned earlier that you disclose to your students that you are autistic.
Right.
What tips do you have for other autistic people when disclosing either to their professor or to their employer?
Well, that's a good question. And when one is disclosing, there's usually a reason. And that reason is self-advocacy. Otherwise, there's no reason to say anything. So when we disclose and when we advocate, the first thing we need to consider is whether the effect of being autistic significantly impacts a situation or a relationship, and there is a need for better mutual understanding. And if that's the case, then we need to think about an advocacy and disclosure plan. If there isn't, then there's really no reason to talk about it. So, for example, for a while I taught statistics at Emerson College in Boston as I was finishing up my doctoral degree. And certainly I know that I'm autistic. Would it make sense to disclose to the class, the statistics class, that I am autistic? And there didn't seem to be any reason to do so. So I never did.
Okay.
But then again, is there something to advocate for that significantly affects the relationship? And so if I was doing it again, probably would be some sort of what I would consider as a partial disclosure. And the reason why, what is the effect of autism? It takes me all semester to remember student faces. So I might have said to the class, if it looks like I don't recognize you outside of class, it's because I don't. And the reason why is that I am really bad at remembering faces. So that's the disclosure. It's a partial disclosure. I didn't talk about autism. I just talked about the specific aspect of autism that's causing the challenge. And then why did I bother to disclose in the first place? Well, it'd be really helpful to me if you reintroduce yourself to me outside of class if you have a question. So that's the advocacy piece. And making sure that I advocate in a way that the other person can understand and provide support. And maybe it's even just one sentence. Yeah, gee, I wonder if it's okay if I wear this hat at work because those lights are really bright and they give me a headache. So that could be another form of advocacy. A full disclosure, sometimes that's more appropriate, such as you're dating and you're getting into a relationship with somebody. That person should probably know fairly soon. Or, in my case, if I'm teaching a course on diagnosis and intervention in autism, or giving an autism presentation, in that situation, it makes sense to do a full disclosure.
Right, because it's relevant to what you're talking about too, and people can get a sense that it's coming from a firsthand experience also.
Right.
And how about on the topic of disclosing the diagnosis to children when they're younger? Because I know this comes up with some parents who aren't really sure what's the right age, and if we are really trying to break that stigma, it should come early enough that the child can form a positive impression of what autism is in their lives, right?
Yeah, well, I think it should come early. The sooner the better. It needs to be done in a developmentally appropriate manner. So you might not be talking about autism to the 5-year-old, but you might be talking about, remember yesterday when you had a really hard time and the bus was an hour late and you had a meltdown? That's because your brain works differently and it's harder for you to wait or to deal with something that's unexpected. However, at the same time, the way your brain is wired, it makes you really good at some of these other things. So in that way, you're talking about differences, but you haven't gotten to the label yet. And I think by the time you get to the label, that's when a person should be very familiar with their strengths and their challenges and accepting of them and working with them. And then finally, the label is the last piece of that proverbial puzzle that helps explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah. What do you think about ID cards for people, especially to prevent any kind of dangerous police interaction if they're stopped in the street because they're exhibiting some behaviors that call attention to police officers intervening? Do you think it's appropriate to then show a card that says, I have autism, so that it can kind of mitigate any negative consequence?
No, I think that can be very helpful. It's always a person's choice as to whether they use the card, but it's better to have it when you need it than not have it when you need it. So having some sort of ID card like that can be very helpful. The police have been doing a lot of work on awareness of autism as well. I've done some work with some police departments such as NYPD. We even developed a training video for their new recruits so that they can recognize when somebody might be autistic, when they might be encountering an autistic person, and that things may be a little bit different. You will have to be aware of differences in communication and eye contact and various movements that, for the police officer, in normal situations, suggest that somebody is guilty of something.
Mm-hmm.
But it might just be the way the autistic person perceives and reacts to the environment. And having an ID card can certainly be helpful.
Yeah. All right, Stephen, we are coming to a close here, but I do have one last question. What advice would you give to other self-advocates who are looking for ways to move society along the 4 A's towards, that appropriate level of appreciation and action?
I think it's basically just being out there in the community. And however that is done by that person, for some people it's more electronic in nature on social media. For others, it's physically being out there. With the pandemic, it's been mostly electronic for everybody. But before and then eventually after, it will be safe to travel and be able to do more of this work in person, and also teaming up with other advocates. Because we can be much more effective in numbers. So getting to know other autistic people in the community, seeing what they're doing, working on collaborative efforts, either joining other people's efforts or having people join your efforts. Because working together, we can do much more than any one of us can do alone.
Yes. And how can people learn more about you?
They can look me up on the internet, drstevenshore.com. If you go onto YouTube, you'll find a number of videos of presentations that I've done. You can also find me on Facebook and LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great talking with you, and I look forward to when we can work together in person.
Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. As Stephen pointed out, we still have a lot of work to do in order to move from awareness to acceptance to appreciation to action. Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. If you enjoy this podcast and you'd like to support our mission, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review. You'll be helping us to continue spreading autism awareness and acceptance around the world. Thanks for listening. Take care.